Hi everyone and welcome to our Women in Leadership event. I'm Emily, our senior content writer at Meet, who wrote the white paper that this discussion will be based on, and I am joined by Hannah, our CEO, and Kerry from IQVIA. So can you introduce yourselves to our audience today, please?
Yeah, I'll go first. My name is Hannah Haigh. I am Chief Exec of Meet. We are a life sciences talent organisation based here in London, but also in Berlin, New York, San Francisco and San Diego.
And I'm Kerry Randall. I am Global Head of Site Activation for IQVIA. That's in the Research and Development Solutions part of the business.
So to start our discussion today, I thought it would be nice to let our audience know what both of your journeys have been like into your leadership positions.
I can go first. So I've had a bit of an interesting, non-conventional probably journey into life sciences. So I actually started my career in international tax, interestingly, and I fell into the clinical research organisation world by accident. Essentially. So I applied for a role in contracts and proposals quite some time ago for another organisation, had a wonderful career journey, lots of experience. And that really led me to an opportunity in my current organisation where I actually started in the Singapore office. So spent nearly 5 years in Singapore, moved back to the UK. When I had my first child, we decided we wanted to be closer to family, and at that point was offered to move into a very different part of the organisation. So that's when I moved into operations. So very much a non-conventional route into operational leadership, I guess. But that's my journey.
Good. So it's been my journey into staffing and recruitment. So my undergrad is in psychology. I always had a really keen interest in people and behaviour and what sort of drove individuals to make decisions. I made the decision that I didn't want to follow down a clinical route. Both my parents are medics, so I think that either drives you to or against. And in my case, I didn't want to work within a clinical environment. I was really interested in business and particularly actually, as I look back on it now, entrepreneurship was something that without really knowing it was something that engaged me, interested me. So I started my career in recruitment in a large corporate recruitment organisation, had a great start. I really valued the beginning of my career there, certainly from a sort of learning and development perspective, but wanted to be in an environment which was more entrepreneurial and autonomous. And then in 2005 started Meet, a brand new life sciences recruitment organisation as it was at that time, and then have gone through sort of very many chapters of startup there. So we started up in London covering the European business. We then moved over to the Americas in 2015. I moved over with a small team to New York where we scaled in the States, and then returned back to the UK in 2019. Similar story, just before I had my first child.
It's really interesting that neither of you have scientific degrees or backgrounds, and I think that's really important for a lot of our network to know going into positions in life sciences. Speaking of you both in leadership positions, what is the biggest challenge you've faced in getting to where you are today?
It's a good question. Maybe I'll take a pass first. I think for me, it has been, I've made a few sort of big changes through my career journey. Like I said, and as you said, very much a non-conventional route. So for me, it has really been about believing in myself enough to make those leaps. Yeah. I've been very lucky in my journey to be surrounded by a lot of mentors, people who've really supported me, believed in me and encouraged me to make those leaps. But ultimately, moving to Singapore or moving, into a brand new area of the business that I knew nothing about at a relatively senior level, it required just a bit of a, right, you've got this, jump in feet first and go for it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's in many ways similar for me. I think, I always, from a young age, had drive, determination, and a sort of natural leadership style, I suppose. And I can look at lots of things, you know, through childhood where I kind of resumed that leader role. And often that came through in a very maternal way, I would say. But then from a business perspective, you know, I was really driven by solution finding, and I think actually that's created a lot of opportunity for me in leadership. So you know, whilst that is challenging, I think it was a sort of natural way of going into leadership. And then it's about resiliency, I suppose. So, you know, talking to the challenges, being able to have the resiliency and the ability to be able to lean on others, lean into situations to deliver on a career in leadership, I think, you know, for me has probably been definitely provided the biggest twists and turns, but in the same way as given the most amount of professional satisfaction.
Yeah, I think speaking of challenges, obviously in a senior position you've got to make a lot of difficult decisions. How do you approach difficult decision making or difficult situations that you put in as a leader?
I think for me, the challenge is the more senior you get, the less time you have to get very comfortable with all of the data points, all of the information. So a lot of it is about listening, understanding different viewpoints, getting as much information as you can, but then being very comfortable with that's it, that's the decision, you know, kind of trust your gut is a big part of it as well, and then moving on. But also I think a fundamental part of that is accepting there may be times when you haven't made the right decision, and I think how you pivot from that, and you know, for me it's hold your hands up, this wasn't the right approach, we're going to pivot, this is what we're going to do. That's really important as a leader as well.
I think that we said then, that sort of tolerance for discomfort, you know, I think something that you know, I've spoken to my coach a lot about in leadership generally is that being a leader is synonymous with a real high tolerance for discomfort, because you are creating the outcomes in many ways and making the decisions where, of course, you don't know, to your point, whether it's right or wrong, and that can give discomfort. But being able to push past that and actually accept and sit with it, I think for me has been a fundamental part of, you know, success in leadership.
So obviously the white paper is based on women in leadership positions in life sciences specifically, and we delved into the perceived differences between male leadership styles and female leadership styles, which for the most part are based on gender stereotypes. Have you had any experience with this or any thoughts on this?
I think it's the sort of fundamental challenge, I think, as you rightly said in the white paper, around just perception of leadership and how that is, how you can execute as a leader, you know, with typical female character and traits, or typically male character and traits as well. You know, I think for me personally, I've always created comfort with it, is that for me a fundamental value is kindness, and I know that sometimes the kindest way to lead is by giving transparent feedback, being challenging in terms of developmental support for individuals around you. So I think, you know, that has certainly helped me, that notion of, you know, I'm being strong, but I'm being kind. And that's given me the confidence to, you know, maybe demonstrate more atypical male traits. And that's a huge generalization, of course, but in a way that feels authentic and aligned to my values as well.
I've actually got a quote here from the white paper that has stuck with me, and it goes, women are often labelled as harsh and insensitive, whereas men are commended for being outspoken and honest. Women are deemed aggressive, whereas men are considered ambitious. Throughout either of your careers, have you noticed men being commended for exhibiting certain traits that you might have been perceived negatively for doing the exact same thing?
I'll be honest, I've been very lucky in my journey. I have not experienced this directly, but I think it's that whole likability versus competence piece.
Yeah.
So a lot of the traits that we value in a leader, decisiveness, assertiveness, kind of go against the grain in terms of what the societal norms are for women. And I think there was a case, it's Columbia Business School. I think one of the professors, there was a really successful female venture capitalist, and they wrote a case study. And half the class, they gave the case study as Heidi Roizen, I think it was. And the other half, they changed the name to Howard. And they asked them just to, write a bit of a summary. How would it be to work with this person? And those that got Howard, great guy, would love to work with this leader, feel I could learn a lot from him. And exact same case study, they literally just changed the names. When it was Heidi, a lot of people, she's very ambitious, very out for herself, not sure I'd want to be led by her. And this was by males and females in the class. And I think, it's a commonly used case study, but so interesting. I like to think that's changing, to your point, Hannah, around, you can be kind and strong, you can be kind and tough, you can still be decisive, assertive, but balance that with more, female stereotypical strengths.
I think I'd agree as well. I don't think I have been in my career disadvantaged by peers or people that I'm reporting into demonstrating, typical male traits versus typical female traits. It's not a disadvantage for me, but I do often find it very interesting that I can be in social environments, I can be in some professional environments, and if I say I'm chief exec of a high growth recruitment organisation, or that I delivered an MBO in 2021, people are surprised, and I take it as a compliment, but it is interesting that the immediate response I typically get is, really? Wow. It's almost like my demeanour, my character, my life decisions is still sort of has a disconnect to the trajectory in which my career has gone on. So, it's less disadvantaged, but I do find that really interesting.
It's really
that
fascinating,
a lot of
isn't
the
it?
time and again, I take it as a compliment, as I've said, but there is surprise around, my character and my personality and my career.
If you think about just like younger generations with reactions like that, do you think that puts more pressure on younger girls or younger boys, in that younger boys are not reaching those expectations that maybe people wouldn't be shocked if you were a man saying that, or for girls to be like wanting to change that narrative and for that to be a lot more accepted, I suppose?
I think there's a journey. I mean, Kerry and I had a conversation about this, before, about this sort of just very basic, girls are bossy, boys are, I can't remember the word you use, strong.
It's like brave.
Brave, that's it, yeah.
Bravery deficit.
Yeah, exactly. And, this sort of notion of, the old school boys don't cry, all of this type of stuff that, again, I would agree, we're definitely on a positive journey. And I think more than ever, young girls, children are being encouraged and supported to deliver on whatever they want to be and to do. So I think from a child's perspective, it's probably getting better. It's then about how, we harness that within a commercial environment.
Yeah.
And the traits, the other example I was going to give, and again, this is less about my experience, but my experience of leading, there is a definite difference between the amount of conversations I have had since I've owned and led the business with my male employees about pay rises than my female employees about pay rises. In fact, I would say, in the female leadership cohort within the business, I can count on one hand when they have come to me and said, I have done this competitor analysis, I've taken on this extra project, I've done all of these things. So, I know we're going to talk a little bit about the gender pay gap, but again, it talks to those behaviours, I think, and just the willingness and the ability to demonstrate the traits that get career enabling outcomes.
Yeah,
it's really interesting you say that, actually, because in the white paper there was a study that I did not that I did, but I researched as part of the wider reading, and it was like, I can't remember exactly the statistics, but it was basically showed the differences between when people asked for a pay rise, those who received it, and when they didn't ask for any kind of benefit or compensation, that they didn't. And it was the difference between men asking for those things and women asking for those things. Yeah. And I think and even applying for jobs, men are a lot more likely to apply for jobs they're not qualified for, whereas women won't.
Yeah. I think all of that though goes back to this notion of the bravery deficit, right? We have historically brought our girls up to be perfect, polite, and boys to be brave. I mean, it's it sounds quite old-fashioned, and it is changing, but I think that is what we see now. To your point, a female typically, if they haven't got 100% of the qualifications, the experience, wouldn't apply for a role, versus I think they say males it's about 60%, and the same is true in terms of the pay rise. But I have to believe that we're so much more thoughtful now. I think, my niece, I have a 4-year-old niece, and you hear words like bossy and sassy, and I'll jump on it. She's not bossy and sassy. She's going to be a strong leader, she's going to do really well, and we just have to keep change, not trying to quieten that down. We have to encourage it, because those are going to be great strengths as she grows.
For sure. So obviously balancing authority and approachability is a growing demand for the next generation of people entering leadership positions in the workforce, and particularly for women. How have you been able to incorporate both authority and approachability into your leadership roles?
I mean, I talk about authenticity all of the time in the business, with my investors, in external coaching that I do, because I truly believe it is the fundamental value that will create equity and inclusion. We talk about being able to bring your whole selves to work, and that being a really, important part of, being an employee or, somebody who delivers service, to our customers. And most people, if they're being truly authentic, are approachable. It's when we drop that authenticity guard that I think approachability starts to become compromised as well. So a lot of it for me is about authenticity and genuinely actively listening as well. Again, you are much likely to be approachable and authentic in your response if you are actively listening and surrounding yourself with content and views and opinions that mean that you're getting the information, to your point before, to be able to make the decisions as a leader that you won't be a subject matter expert in by its nature. I think authenticity is really key.
Yeah, completely agree. I mean, I think having that ability to create a culture where you are approachable, because it is authentic, where you're creating a safe space for people to come and, hands up, Kerry, I've made a mistake and this is what I'm going to do about it. That lends itself to then, in situations where you need to sort of step up as a leader and be a bit more directive, there's more receptiveness to that almost. But I do see things shifting, and I think, in a really positive way. In my current role, I'm on a leadership program. It's a new leadership program, And as part of the kickoff actually last month, they invited, some pretty seasoned executives, all in sort of general manager roles to come and talk to us. And this came up a lot, this notion of, you've got to be very balanced. You can't be too heavy in one area. You've got to be very balanced. It is about active listening. It is about that being comfortable with being uncomfortable, making those decisions. But a lot of it is around, the people that you surround yourself with. Yeah. Making sure that you're not becoming too biased towards, a certain group, a certain department, whatever it may be. And just, really creating that culture where people will come to you. You can listen, you are listening. And like you say, it all comes down to authenticity.
Yeah. And I think in some ways, I think the sort of gender divide within the workplace has perpetuated some of the problems because, I know how difficult it is to be approachable when you are incredibly busy because you're trying to deliver and execute on lots of different things, working to tight deadlines, and that doesn't always come hand in hand with being particularly approachable. You have to be active in your intent to be approachable when you are very busy and, as I say, executing on lots of different things. And I think that's where that gender divide is self-perpetuating, isn't it? Because historically it is our male counterparts that have been in those busier roles, those more responsibility fueled positions. So I don't think it's just about gender stereotypes, but it's definitely not helped.
Another key factor that I think has really, especially for me, I think it was my key takeaway from doing all of this research, was the lack of mentorship opportunities for women in leadership positions. And that comes down to a lack of sponsors and mentors and coaching and leadership programs. How do you think having a mentor has helped you embrace your role as a leader today?
I feel really sad that came across, actually, because again, I've been incredibly lucky in my journey, and actually I don't think I would have, although I love a challenge, and I, personally, professionally, I don't think I'd have jumped into some of the things I've jumped into without the active mentorship and support that I've had. I think mentors, and you don't even, a coach, a mentor, somebody you can lean on, an ally, is just so critical wherever you're at in your journey. And for me, it's always been really important to, there is this tendency to sort of, you gravitate towards somebody that you're going to click with really quickly, etc. I think it's really good to sort of have a mentor outside of your immediate function, department, whatever it may be, who's at a different point in their career, maybe doing something very differently, maybe has a very different style to you. I think you can get a lot from that. But what I would say is I love it when people come to me and say, hey, Kerry, I heard you talking, would you mentor me? I never say no, and I think people really shouldn't be afraid. If you're inspired by somebody in your workplace, wherever it may be, ask the question. Because honestly, I think most people, mentor, mentee, it's a two-way thing. You get so much from it.
Yeah. I think partly, again, if you think of the findings in the white paper that you just talked about as well, I think it's about, women are less likely to ask the question, I would love it if you would mentor me. There's that sort of discomfort again of, not getting the answer that you want or putting yourself out there. But I think, what I appreciate is that from a gender perspective, it's not just about mentors or mentees being women. Actually, I think it's really important for male leaders to both mentor women and also aspire to have mentors that are female as well, because that's how we'll learn, that's how we'll get a sense of perspective and an understanding of what it looks like. So I think, my biggest advice on that is that there's an expectation that sort of being a mentor or being mentored is this intense, heavy lifting relationship. And in my experience, that's just not the case at all. You know, there are people throughout my career that I would say have acted as a mentor, and I've probably spoken to them twice. But what they said and the impact that they had on me has been really, really, really long lasting. So I think it's about changing that expectation of what, you know, being a mentor or being a mentee is. You know, it's about surrounding yourself with people that will challenge you and create a different way of thinking that ultimately is complementary to your career trajectory.
Yeah, I think that's really true as well, because I think, I mean, just looking at my experience, is when I think of people who've really impacted my career or even my mindset of how I look at my work, probably have no idea of the level of impact that they've had on me. And some of them can be like my peers, and some of them can be my seniors, but it's not been like put out there as like a mentor-mentee relationship. It's just what you've got out of that relationship.
So that, but you know, you don't have to wait for your organisation or the company that you're part of to put in a mentorship program. You know, it must be in so many ways an organic way of just learning and operating. And as I said, I think it's gone into that box of until I am matched, and it's sort of
it has to be really formal.
It's formal and the cadence is defined and all of those type of things. I think your example that you gave there, Kerry, is so good. It's like if someone comes to you and said, I was fascinated. You know, I went to a private equity conference last week, and one of the people talking there was a chief exec of a travel company, you know, totally disconnected to what we do, what the purpose of my business is, what the past experiences are. But actually there were 2 or 3 things that he said that really stuck with me in terms of some of the challenges I am having at the moment in terms of leading my business. And it was exactly that. I sent him a quick email saying, your speech was really inspirational and perfectly timed for some of the challenges that I'm looking to overcome at the moment. I'd love to take half an hour of your time. So again, I think I would just encourage, because we're talking about here, I would encourage women to just put down those barriers.
Yes.
Get yourself out there. Don't wait for it to be delivered to you. And absolutely take advantage of the people that you can surround yourself by that will just elevate your mind and your career.
Completely agree.
I think as well, a key point there, which is something I always try and remind myself of, is that I think with things like that, the fear of rejection can be really like terrifying and stop you from doing things. And with any situation that ever I'm put in that I'm really excited by but terrified by, I always have to be like, well, if nothing comes of it, my life tomorrow will be the same as today. Like nothing's changing.
It's the worst that can happen.
But I think that is a female trait, if we're honest, right? And so, but then I try and look at it another way. Is someone really going to be offended if I reach out to them like you did and say, hey, I was really inspired by your presentation? You know,
it's not many
if anything,
people
you're
who
going to
would,
make their day, right?
Yeah, totally.
Just speaking of mentor relationships, I know, Hannah, you mentor other women from outside of Meet. What nudged you to do that?
I talked about before this value of kindness, and for me it's a way of like validating that value and being able to kind of hang my hat on something, I suppose. I find it really beneficial for me as well, understanding, you know, it is that reverse mentoring mentality of it is not just the mentee that takes value from those type of relationships. So, you know, that's the other side of it, different perspectives, different ways of being that's outside of, you know, my world is valuable there as well. So, you know, lots of reasons. And actually, you know, historically I have been asked to or have actively offered to mentor high-performing women within the recruitment industry, because there's been a huge shift in female representation within leadership roles. I'm still in a huge minority of female chief execs. You know, I don't know the exact stats, but it is an obvious and clearly non-equitable sort of position. So, I've done that sort of quite, typically, but actually increasingly I've been looking outside of that world as well, because, as I say, and definitely I would say it's sort of through my investors and the portfolio businesses within, the private equity firm that invest in us, it's allowed me to sort of cast the net wider, both in terms of receiving support from mentors, but also being able to, use my perspective to aid wider businesses. But it's fundamentally, to answer your question, Emily, it's fundamentally because I get a lot from it.
Yeah.
It's not an entirely unselfish act.
Speaking of the life sciences space in particular, I know you've had pretty good experience with mentors, Kerry. But how do you find those kinds of, programs or opportunities within life sciences? Do you think they come along quite frequently in your experience, or it is one of those things you need to reach out and
I think it depends on the organisation, right? I do think increasingly, especially larger organisations, have a lot of programs like that, and they're there for the taking. So I think, if somebody wants to grow, they should absolutely leverage those opportunities. But back to what Hannah was saying, you've also got to look outside of that. So if you are in a position where you don't see that kind of formal structure, it's finding somebody that inspires you, that you think you can learn from. Their path has been really interesting, and just jumping and introducing yourself and asking the question. I actually think you can get, sometimes these formal mentorships can feel very formal and structured, and it adds a layer of pressure versus a less formal, and mentors even, a strong, choice of words, I guess, like the situation you shared. It can be you've met with somebody twice, but they've had a really profound impact. So I don't think anybody should be held back if there's not a formal mentorship program in place in their organisation. You can look more broadly, you can reach outside of your organisation, but also within, just ask the question.
Yeah. I think life sciences in so many ways is well set up because just of the volume of conferences and the amount of environments where people from all different organisations with all different therapeutic backgrounds, with all totally different skill sets come together under the banner of innovation and business fulfillment. So I think in lots of ways, if I compare, for example, the staffing world and the life sciences world, I think there's loads of opportunities in life sciences. Because a lot of the work that is being done is hugely innovative and very inspiring, but there's just these collections and these events that mean that the opportunity to secure mentorship authentically, I think is really available to professionals.
As like a business that has access to both businesses and employees in the life sciences space, do you think there's a way that we can help create those relationships for people by having like such a big network around the globe?
Yeah, we've definitely thought about this as looking at what we do and what our sort of value proposition and service proposition is outside of sort of conventional executing on mandates, helping organisations grow through talent attraction, actually looking at the kind of consulting arm of it. And one of the things that we've often discussed is that nature of just connecting people in order to be able to help them fulfill their ambitions, etc. So I definitely think as our business grows and evolves, we'll be looking for these, opportunities.
Yeah.
But again, it talks to what I've said before: is feel really strongly it doesn't need to be formally introduced. It's just about, asking the question and surrounding yourself with the right people.
Yeah, I think when I look at it in that sense, it's just more about connecting those people because we've got such a big community and they're huge. So involved in everything we do, and they love finding out what each other is working on. And things like that. So I think it's just being able to kind of connect those dots for them.
I suppose in some ways, if I look at kind of the suite of services that we have, we do quite a lot of board advisory stuff, particularly within biotech. So it's kind of exactly the same. It's, connecting
Yeah.
people that have got really, rare and complementary skill sets to be able to help support and aid businesses moving forwards.
Obviously, there's a lot more men in leadership positions than women. And there's no denying that at all. But women do outnumber and outperform men in schools and colleges, but women hold less than 20% of top leadership positions. Obviously, an enormous discussion point surrounding this is the different expectations of men and women when it comes down to parenthood. As both working mums, did you have any prior fears of how having children could impact your career?
I mean, I think I definitely did. But it was kind of the pressure that I put on myself. I tend to go all in. So whether that's parenthood, whether that's my career, it's been an interesting journey, right? I mean, I was very lucky when I had my when I was pregnant with my second child. Actually, it was very early. I hadn't actually told anybody. I was approached for the role that I'm in. Actually, was asked if I would like to apply. And at the time, I think I was 6 weeks pregnant, and it was a male who asked me the question. And, I thought, shall I say anything? Should I? So I said, look, I'll be honest, I'm pregnant. It's very early. And he looked at me and he said, that changes nothing. It's really up to you. And whatever you decide, whether you decide to go for it or whether you decide not to, there'll be opportunities down the line. And that really shaped things for me. Just kind of having that support made me realise, you can, in the right organisation with the right leaders, you can find a way to make it work. I actually took the role, but equally, it would have been absolutely fine had I not. But I think for a lot of people it is, especially, the age, and it's wide ranging, but the age that you would typically have children, you're at a point in your career. It's a really difficult thing. I think for me, and I appreciate it depends on the organisation and your manager and what have you. It's just about being really open, and it doesn't have to stop you. Now, with that said, and we spoke about this before, for me, it's been an interesting journey. I put a lot of pressure on myself. It wasn't society, it was me. I want to be all things. I'm working full time. I mean, I sort of, a busy job. You want to be the best parent that you can be. I definitely tried to do it all, and it took a little while, especially once I came to sort of number 2, to realise you can't quite, sometimes you've got to give. Something's got to give. So it's been a journey, but it definitely it's a unique one for a woman, and something I think we've got some work to do. We need to talk about a little bit more openly, I think.
Yeah, I think for me, prior to having my children, I thought an inordinate amount about timing, well, if this happens and then this happens and then this happens and it all falls into exactly my plan, then that would be the best way of doing it. And what I've realised is there's no such thing as a good time. There's no such thing. It's the right time, absolutely. It is about, navigating, and I'm a real firm believer in this, sort of seasons of life. And, if you look at my situation, it so happened that sort of my, career peak is literally hand in hand with me becoming a parent. That's the way my life has gone. And, in many ways, it would have been, again, better to, have had my children younger or have particularly, focused on certain career milestones. But it's just not life, it just doesn't happen like that. So I think I was definitely apprehensive, but I think it was the apprehension came from just trying to get it exactly right. And the lesson that I've learned is that there is no right time. It is about, navigating what's in front of you and accepting the support and being able to do it that way. But, again, we talked about this before, but, I am in a still unconventional situation in as much as that, I am the working parent. My husband and I hate it when people say this, but doesn't have a proper job. You know, he does lots and lots of different things, as well as, you know, taking the lead at home. But that is a privileged position, but definitely gives space for it to be the other way around.
Yeah, I think a lot of kind of the thoughts on that is changing with how just the workforce is changing, and a lot more women are in leadership positions. And I just, even when I speak to like my group of girlfriends in London, and I don't know if it's that we're all in London and we're all very like career driven, I don't know what it is, but I know for all of us it seems like something that will happen a bit later than what is maybe or was traditional a few years ago. I don't know.
It's definitely the trajectory, I think, of, I mean, again, it'd be interesting to know the exact data, but, you know, I laugh with my girlfriends is that, you know, we were all firmly in geriatric mother status when our children came along, you know, and I couldn't believe it when I was referred to a geriatric mother. I was like, what? You don't even call old people geriatric these days. Like, it's an awful,
but I think
awful
even
descriptor.
That in itself,
yeah,
in itself,
it sort of, it does
horrible.
definitely, you know, talk to it. To me, a lot of this comes into the changes that are definitely starting but are critical around parental leave and creating infrastructure that means that it is not the assumed that women should stay at home and look after young children and men earn the salary. You know, and actually, even though shared parental leave, I think, has evolved. You know, I've had a couple of, you know, 2 or 3 cases of women in my business that have gone to go and have children, have looked at parental leave, but it's not realistic because actually it's set up in a way that means that financially, by making the decision to have shared parental leave, you are financially disadvantaged. And until that changes,
we won't
they won't see absolutely they won't see the shift. It's impossible.
There's just so much to unpack with all of this though. I mean, even just going back to your point about, you know, being a geriatric mother, as I am too. I mean, even just the fact we use that term. I mean,
horrible, isn't it?
I had my eldest son when we were in Singapore, and so went 2 weeks after he was born, went for a checkup, and I kid you not, she sat us down, my husband and I, she sat next to me, and she said, "Now look, you're of a certain age, Kerry, and if you'd like to think about a second, we should be talking about that fairly quickly." Now, bear in mind, I had a 2-week-old newborn at that point, you know, but there's, just so much to unpack. And the parental leave, I completely agree. I think it's almost like a lot of companies have made a nod, it's there, but to your point, it's not effective. It's not where it needs to be.
I think it is such a like deciding factor for a lot of people as well, though, because even when I speak about it with like girls at work, like girls outside work, is that for loads of us, we're just like, I just don't even know how I'd be able to possibly afford to do that. It, like, especially in this economy right now, it's a really, like, it feels like you've got to choose one over the other, and then by doing so, are you reducing your quality of life? Like, I don't know, there's a lot to go into it, and it's quite overwhelming, to be honest.
I think a lot of it is just about, you know, that belief. You know, I'm just not a believer that being a mother of a young family and, use my example, chief exec of a organisation means that you can get balance in both parts of your lives. To me, it ebbs and flows, and there is almost a real, you know, acceptance of that. In order to be able to get, you know, satisfaction in both parts of your life, you have to accept that you can't aspire to just perfect balance, because it just simply doesn't work like that. And, you know, I say all the time, like, the juggle is real, but I wouldn't want to be without either. And I think that's what we've got to do. We've got to encourage a future where people aren't expected, or women are not expected to just create the perfect balance, because the expectation on that is just enormous. But equally, increasing confidence that you can be professionally satisfied and raise a young family. You know, that's what we've got to aspire to.
I think part of this is something I've always tried to do as a female leader with a young family is normalise, you know, so I don't apologise for the fact that, hey guys, I've got to wrap this meeting early because my son's got to play, or I'll be very open and very deliberate about that. Whereas I think, you know, before it's almost, you know, this whole you're expected to work like you haven't got a family and parent like you haven't got a job. And to your point, that's just impossible. So the two have to kind of coexist. And for me, that looks like just being very open about it so that others can look and think, well, if she can do it, I can, hopefully.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
I think it is important.
And again, be comfortable with the discomfort.
Yeah.
You know, I think that point that you made before, you're supposed to work like you've not got children and parent as if you've not got a job. Like, I think, again, comes back to that notion of authenticity. You know, I think it is okay to say, you know, this is really hard. You know, it's really tough, but I want to do it.
Yeah.
I think one of the other things that I've thought a lot about with this as well is that, you know, I've always felt very supported as a mother with a young family, as a pregnant mother. You know, I've got a really engaged and supportive team around me, and I was never made to feel like it was, you know, a problem. You know, and I think that's really important because, you know, naturally you have those fears, like it will be, as I've said, about finding that perfect time that doesn't necessarily exist. But again, it was really interesting for me going into, you know, when we took investment, I had a 1-year-old at the time, you know, one-year-old, 39 years old, you know, at the time. And therefore, understandably, there was an expectation that wouldn't be my only child, and that, you know, I would be taking a maternity leave. And actually, my investors have been absolutely amazing throughout, prior to my pregnancy, during my pregnancy with my second, during a period of time that I took out. I really couldn't have asked for more. And really, again, unsurprisingly, there's lots of female chief execs within their portfolio. So I think, you know, the two absolutely go hand in hand. But I wouldn't say that was the same with a lot of the other organisations that I spoke to about investment before. You know, there was a real obvious and palpable concern that me having a baby and a mat leave and having a young family would have a detrimental effect on the performance of the business. And that's not, you know, I've challenged myself sometimes and think, you know, is it in my head? But actually, if I roll back some of the conversations about, you know, questions about my family being complete or not, questions about how long I took for maternity leave with my first, you know, again, there is that, I think it definitely still exists, that there is a fear that motherhood means that you cannot pursue a career in quite the same way. And that's what I am dedicated to prove otherwise, I suppose.
That's quite unbelievable. If you were a male in that situation, there was no way.
No flinch,
That you wouldn't have been asked that question.
No. And look, there's, you know, again, I can find empathy sometimes there because, you know, as women, we have to have the babies, and there is the, you know, physical changes that come with that. And, you know, I run a business in America where, you know, women are typically back to work after 6 weeks. You know, it's a whole different ball game in terms of the expectation around maternity or parental leave. So I can find empathy for it, but equally, if we don't change that position, there will always be the concern that you've talked about, Emily, about were you concerned? Of course, if it remains a concern, it will be concerning. Yeah. The change is about saying it's not easy. It does involve sacrifice and juggle, but you can be professionally satisfied and professionally ambitious and have a young family.
Obviously, parenthood is a huge topic for women in leadership, but other like women's health topics that have had a lot of airtime recently is the topic of menopause, especially for women in senior positions. Have you got any thoughts on that, of how I suppose you tackle that with, especially seeing as we've got a majority female workforce?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. it feels like, and we were joking, I don't know whether it's because I'm a woman approaching a certain age that I'm aware of, all of the content that surrounds menopause at the moment, or whether actually just the volume of it has increased. And I think it's the latter in many ways. When we talk about parenthood, often I talk about this notion of kind of the seasons of life that you're in. And I think the reality is it's becoming increasingly clear, that menopause for all women is a season of life. And the way I've thought of it a lot from a leadership perspective is that probably historically, because of the gender gap, there just haven't been that many people there haven't been the volume of women in senior leadership roles that have been through menopause, post-menopause, that are then driving outcomes to mean that it is more inclusive for menopausal women moving forwards. And I'd like to think some of the change here is because that is now no longer true. There is more lived experience, which is driving understanding and and outcomes there as well. So it's definitely something I've thought of. And for me, it's all about making sure that we understand the challenge. We're asking questions without leading answers or with any notion of bias or discriminatory outcome. And then, we're creating businesses that allow people to navigate these seasons of life in a way where, exactly as I said with parenthood, you can both get professional satisfaction and also navigate these things, which are just an inevitable part of your future.
I mean, I think you're absolutely right. The lived experiences thing, right? If I think of myself as a parent, I thought I understood parents, but until I had a child and 2 children, it definitely changes your perspective. Yeah. So absolutely, the more women in leadership at the top, the more that kind of filters down, coupled with, and I love the fact it's no longer the taboo that it was, right? You hear men talking about the menopause and all sorts as well. So I think that then allows, and companies obviously have a huge responsibility here, but it allows those conversations. So, in my organisation, we've had, several sessions on, on menopause, and men are really encouraged to attend. And actually, it's great to see the number of men attending, but also other things, male mental health, things like that. I think that shift that we're seeing is something we should really, harness and encourage. And I think that will, part of that shift, as you say, is maybe because we are starting to see more female leaders at the top. So we've got to really, really encourage that.
Yeah, I think key as well of that, like you just touched on, is educating men on those things like menopause, because obviously they don't affect men, so they have to be educated.
But I feel that like I'm empathetic to that situation, because I, being premenopausal, I don't know what to expect, or certainly didn't before some of this, but it's something that's not talked about, that's not discussed, that's not understood. I think that is the difference. If you look at, I think there's so much understanding now around the challenges of becoming a mother, becoming a parent, and actually there's an education piece around menopause, which of course impacts women, and of course means that actually a lot of the side effects, as I've gone on to learn, are things that actually impact performance within the workplace. Being a parent is logistically very difficult, I would say, at times, and obviously there's the physicality of pregnancy and childbirth and everything that comes with it. But I think the direct correlation between menopause and the impact on your ability to be able to be high performance professionally is something that means that within a professional environment, within a corporate environment, it needs to be much more understood.
Yeah. I think even from a female perspective as well, is just even having an idea of what possibly is coming your way, because it's not spoken about at all.
It certainly wasn't as I was growing up. I mean, it's been a fascinating shift even in the last couple of years. And again, a bit like I was saying about, as a parent, I feel like I have a responsibility to be very open about things. Likewise, we'll see. But, as you're going through the menopause and, because we're able to be more open about it, it becomes less of a taboo. People can recognise and understand, what somebody's going through, the impact to performance, and then what you can put in place to support that individual or those individuals.
For me, what it makes me think about a lot is just about leadership through lived experience, and I've got a slightly parallel, situation here. Is we have a charity partner within our business, which is Maggie's, which is a cancer charity. That's a charity that I became personally aware of because of, cancer, within my family. And in some ways, it's taken my lived experience to drive real change in terms of how we think about cancer within the workplace, how we think about how we can engage with charity partners. And I think this theme comes through a lot with women in leadership, is that historically we've waited for lived experience to drive change, whereas actually I think now there's a lot about making sure that it doesn't have to be lived experience that drives change. It just has to be an awareness and understanding of the things that can impact equality and inclusion within the workplace.
Speaking of things that have impacted the workplace, one major thing was the pandemic, obviously.
Yeah.
And since the pandemic, prior to the pandemic, the global gender gap was set to close within 100 years. And now post-pandemic, it's now expected to take 132 years. So that gap is growing. I think there is obviously a few factors that contribute to this. And I think a lot of that was the pandemic saw a lot of people quit their jobs. It saw a lot of people had to reduce their hours and increase their caregiving load, whether that was with children or with elderly relatives. And overall, I think the pandemic just exposed some gender inequalities that maybe had kind of slipped under the radar a bit until everything slowed down. What are your views on this gap and it growing? And what do you think we can do to stop it growing even further at this point?
It's interesting, isn't it? Because in so many ways, that stat and that data is counter to the fact that I really do believe there is progress being made. And there's lots of environments where we can see positive trajectory in female representation in leadership roles and chief exec roles, right across the business. But again, to me, this comes very much back to this motherhood subject, because I think it sounds like from the data there that a lot of that was pinned in this notion of caring responsibilities. I know from close friends, close family, having two working parents during the pandemic was enormously challenging, and I would say in the majority of the cases that it was typically the mothers that had to step back or increase the caregiving responsibilities, and then that became the sort of norm moving forward. So it is interesting because, like I said, it is sometimes, I think, counterproductive to how we feel. I think also what I'd say about the pandemic, which is counter to that stat, is that the pandemic definitely brought about a lot more acceptance when it comes to flexible working. And we've definitely gone back on a journey. I think we've kind of U-turned a little on this, which I don't fight, because I think the value in connection and being in people's company actually as a female leader is really valuable, because I think often the superpower of a female leader is that ability to connect. And I personally find it much easier to connect with people in their company than I do across on a screen. So, I think the pandemic has helped, certainly in the corporate world, that, now as a working mother, as an example, it doesn't mean that you have to miss bedtime 5 days a week, which I know is really difficult for, a lot of people. Happy to miss it a few times, but that constant sort of, balance there as well.
I think it's a really tricky one. I mean, I think, as you say, the pandemic brought about a lot of flexibility. So I think going forward, it's how do you use that to the advantage of women in the workplace and, you know, move, you know, away from that 132 years. I mean, that's pretty shocking. But completely agree with your point around connection. So I feel like some of it is just going to settle, you know, like the pendulum swung very far one way, it's sort of coming back. There's a sweet spot for it to land, and we all need to sort of encourage, you know, that flexibility really should help in a lot of situations. Whereas before, you know, people were in the office 5 days a week.
Presenteeism was
exactly. But then I completely agree with your point in terms of you will never be able to replace face-to-face interaction.
No.
You know, you can be on a screen and, you know, the temptation to multitask is strong when you're in a very busy role. You know, you've got to really sort of fight to be present. When you're in a room with somebody, it's a very different, you don't have that same
and
struggle.
It's almost, for me, it goes full circle to that authority piece as well. You know, it is a lot harder, I think, to be really authoritative in a Zoom meeting with 6 people and you can't read the responses and understand the position. So again, I think in so many ways it comes full circle to those gender stereotypes and the character traits associated to female leaders and male leaders. Again, finding that balance, I think, is really important for female leaders across the board.
Yeah. Just similarly, when we were looking at life sciences, if we look at the gender pay gap between 2022 and 2023, it actually doubled from 8% to 16%, which is really shocking, I think. But what can we do to help narrow this gap? I think it comes a lot from people quitting their jobs through the pandemic, and probably post-pandemic as well, and a lot of that did come down to women, like we just touched on. But what can we do, I suppose, as people in the space and as partners of a lot of businesses in the space as well?
I mean, I think we all have a big responsibility here, right? And it goes back to a lot of what we've touched on today. You know, we've got to create an environment that is inclusive, that is flexible, that does allow for the seasons of life. We've got to create an environment where people aren't afraid to ask for mentors, ask for support. And we've got to bring the next generation up not to be afraid to ask for the pay rises and, you know, that kind of thing. So it's like there's the short term, you know, what can we do as female leaders currently? It's creating that culture, that environment, you know, very supportive for everybody. But I think there's the long game piece of it as well in bringing that next generation through to, you know, again, back to that bravery deficit, to bring back, you know, to bring up children, girls especially, to be brave, you know, versus polite and yes, and, you know.
I think also, you know, and we're talking specifically about life sciences because that's the world that we, you know, all exist in. But I think in any environment, you know, we've got to make sure that we're increasing pressure to publicise data around gender pay gaps. And we've got to make sure that, you know, organisations are prioritising assessing their gender pay gaps and why it exists, and creating equality at any and every possibility. It isn't, we touched on it before, Emily, that we've got a really equal gender representation within our business. I'm a female chief exec. I know the top earning person in our business globally is female. So, you know, you could argue actually if you look within our business, it's probably the other way around. But it is interesting, isn't it, that, you know, because I am a female chief exec and I am particularly tuned into the gender pay gap and the challenges that exist within it, that I will always very naturally prod and poke to make sure that we don't have a problem there. And I think it comes back to ownership and drive to do it. You know, we talk a lot about ED&I, and actually it's got to come from the top. It's got to come from it's got to be seen as more than a box ticking exercise, and actually something that drives outcomes, drives business outcomes, and is nonsensical not to look at if you want to have a high-performing, successful business. So I think a lot of this is it is just about pressure to analyse and create internal understanding of these gaps, and also making sure that it's really driven from the top. And that doesn't have to be a woman at the top. It needs to be somebody at the top who's genuinely prioritising gender we're talking about today, but any ED&I policy, because inclusive businesses are the most successful businesses. That there's so much data now that talks to that. And the responsibility, I think, of businesses is just to prioritise it. You know, it sounds so simple, doesn't it? It sounds so
but
simple.
Why wouldn't they?
But
right?
yeah,
Given
exactly. We've got to change that view that this isn't just. It's not about
nice
equality that we can talk about equality. It's about equality because it creates high-performing businesses. And I think then if you connect that back to life sciences and the purpose orientation of what we do, what our customers do, what your organisation delivers and executes on, if we can get gender parity, other ED&I subjects, actually with running alongside a belief infrastructure that it would drive high performance, I think so much more will change.
There was lots to take away from that conversation today, and I just want to really thank you both for being here. Of course, the catalyst for that was the white paper that I've written. If you'd like to find out any more or dive further into any of the themes that we covered today, you can download the white paper that will be linked in the comments below. Thank you so much for joining us, and